All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Magnus Carlsen Invitational after show for the second semifinal day. Another exciting day of chess, really exciting actually, and we have our finalists. Our finalists are Hikaru Nakamura is going to face the world champion Magnus Carlsen in the final tomorrow. I think this is kind of poetic because they faced each other in the very first round in what was a very tough match, maybe the toughest match that Magnus had except for, of course, the last round against Ding Liren in the tournament, where Hikaru won 2 games against him and pushed him all the way to the limit to Armageddon and lost in Armageddon. But it was very close, and so they are going to face off tomorrow, same time, starting at 10 a.m. if you're in the Eastern U.S., I guess 4 p.m. in the main Europe time zone. We had a little bit of a conversation about time zones. Someone in the chat is asking me who is going to have the white pieces in the first game. I believe there's a drawing of lots, and I've had a really busy day, so I actually don't know who won it. I could probably look in my what you would call my office Slack channel and see, but I haven't had time because I've just been I was unexpectedly, some of you may have caught me if you speak French. French is my first language. I was streaming on the French stream all day today during the match because they were having some internet issues, so they were stuck with me. And but that was fun. And after that, I was hosting the Banter Blitz with Maxime Vachier-Lagrave on the French sid, and he's very fast. He's very good. It was a lot of fun. And yeah, now I'm here, but I've barely had time to catch my breath. And yeah, it has been a very long day for me. And yeah, so for me, by the way, it is 3 o'clock. That's why I was saying in the chat, 3 o'clock in the afternoon right now, a little bit past 3. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining me. So we had a pretty crazy day of chess actually, and so I'm kind of gonna dive right in. There's not too much to discuss other than the games themselves. And they were interesting games. I watched them all in common. I was doing commentary live, so I have quite a bit to say. But I'm going to try to keep it somewhat condensed here, of course, as I should. And yeah, so here we go. And I forgot to put my. Well, we'll just go like this. So okay, so I have some scores here, which are actually from when I was streaming earlier. So, but that is the final score of the match. We'll just leave it up there. So, all right, it started with d4, d5. So Magnus decided to. I'm sorry, I have this wasn't the first game. The first game is here. So it started with d4, knight f6, knight f3, d5, and bishop f4. So Magnus has been playing this London system, as many of you probably know, for a long time. He was sort of the strongest player in a while to play it. Before that, probably Gata Kamsky was probably the main player who played the London, at the very highest levels. Used to be kind of considered a quiet, somewhat inoffensive variation. But of course, with Magnus playing it now, all the cool kids are playing it too, and it's considered to have a decent bit of venom. So Ding Liren in the first game plays bishop d6, which is certainly a logical way to play. And Magnus here transposes to a Tory attack with bishop g5. It's also possible to play either e3, and he gets a structure like that in the second game, where you allow the pawns to be doubled in order to control the e5 square. But in this game, he plays bishop g5, bishop e7, and now we have a position that we could reach, by first playing bishop g5 and bishop e7. Both sides have wasted a tempo by moving their bishops twice, and so it just transposes. And so this is a really old variation. It is a little bit dangerous for black, and so Magnus plays this bishop takes f6 plan, which is a known plan. It's a little bit odd to do this without provocation, but he doesn't want to wait for the knight to come to d7 and be able to recapture on f6. So now black is, of course, forced to take with the bishop, and the idea becomes very clear. He's playing h4. And so this is a very aggressive plan. In some cases, you might be threatening to play bishop takes h7. And in other cases, is more like what happens in a game. He plays knight g5. So black plays knight d7. And here, yeah, bishop takes h7 here doesn't really work. because black does have a nice hiding square. So when in these bishop h7 sacrifices, usually you always have to calculate what happens if the king moves forward. And so there's always king g6 or king h6. And in some of these positions, you have a dark squared bishop, so it's much easier to exploit the position of the king. Here, it's not so easy, so black would be okay. So Magnus first plays knight g5, h6. And now the idea is that you leave the knight there and play to open up the h file. And this does look like a very dangerous position for black, but black is not without resources. So the game continues, and they make moves that are very reasonable here. G4, I mean, white sort of has to go for it, right? You don't play F4 and H4 to just sit passively after. So, but his knight is a little bit in the way, so he's going to have to either play knight H7 and then G5, or knight to F3 and then G5, right? Otherwise, he's not really breaking through. Knight F6. So this stops at least the idea of playing knight H7, forcing the rook to move, and then G5, which could be a sacrifice of something, but knight f6, the idea also is that in a lot of cases, after the knight moves, this knight can hop onto e4 and block this important diagonal where white is trying to have play. So white plays a3, and so this was a sort of an interesting moment where it seems like Magnus decided not to go for broke, or at least not to go as much for broke as he could have. The really messy variation here was to play castles, and then it's just a race, right? Like black will probably play c4, we go bishop b1 or bishop c2, then b5, and who knows who's coming here first, right? Like you have plans with white. Maybe bishop b1 is actually interesting. The idea being that in certain cases, maybe we can play this knight to f3 and queen to c2. But yeah, this is just a mess, and it's hard to know. Like we were looking at variations like this on the French stream, and Zealand Zen was saying that you didn't get to watch the French stream. Well, the good news is that because this was caused by an internet problem at Laurent Fressine's house, there's a reasonable chance that I will be back streaming in French tomorrow also, because otherwise they're kind of stuck without being able to host, and they sort of need the host to be able to speak French. So anyway, it's likely that I'll be back in French tomorrow also. So a busy weekend for me. And I have to admit that I will not be too upset when the tournament is over and I get a few days off. I feel like it'd be easier to play than to do all the producing and commentary. But anyway, that's another story. So yeah, castling queenside would have led to mayhem, basically a race on both sides and really complicated. Yeah, so we were looking at these variations with knight e6 and g5. And it's hard to know who's better. I mean, it's so complicated. Something like queen g4, we're threatening e6, we're threatening h6. But black, if you don't get checkmated, you've already taken a piece. And if you don't sacrifice a piece with white, then maybe black will be faster. I mean, it seems like white got the head start, but black is not too far from crashing here either. So just a messy position. But Magnus decides to play it a little bit safer, plays a3. And then the rest of this game actually goes somewhat peacefully, surprisingly, because once black gets to play knight e4, it's much safer, and then he meets g5, of course, with h5, and even though white is certainly has the better side of it here, he couldn't find a way to break through, and so Dingley Ren here found played solidly, and even though pieces get traded and he's got a bad bishop, and we'll get to the position here. This looks like a position that, in the textbooks, you'd say, well, this is a disaster for black. Their bishop is completely blocked by the pawns on the light squares, while white has a perfect position here. However, the problem is that, as we'll see in the game, black is basically setting up a fortress. And so here, they're going to meet b5 with a5 always, and they're going to meet a4, a5 with b5, and even though you're left with a horrible bishop in positions like this, there's simply no breakthrough. There's really nothing that white can do. Even the move e4 won't really help. We could just leave it there. So let's say we make like just moves to get to play e4. So on e4 we can actually just leave it there, play king d7, and then when they take, and this is just going to be, even here we can continue to sit forever. There's nothing, once this gets traded, white has no chance at all. So This is essentially what happens in the game, by the way. And there's not much, I don't think there's much that white can do. He tries to bring the rook to f6 to possibly threaten to take on g6. Unclear if it's really a threat. Um, yeah, I don't know. People are being very kind in the chat. Thank you guys. We of course, we appreciate all the positive feedback, and it's uh it's great to have the chess to look at. But of course, the tournament that lasts 16, 17 days is long for the players and for us who are working both in the background and in the foreground of the event. But our producer, for example, a guy named Sotiris, has been working tirelessly every day, making sure that we have streams in the 9 languages as we do. So it's been a lot of work for everybody. So this game ends peacefully here. Magnus actually does a cheeky move, bishop takes g6, just for fun. There's no way for black's bishop to get. There's a pawn chain here, a pawn chain here. Sorry, the arrow shouldn't be there. And so, of course, this bishop is completely stuck. It can only move in on these squares, and so he's not getting out of the pawn chain. So Magnus, just with a little bit of humor, sacrificing the piece. Of course, not obligated by any means to do that. He could have simply offered a draw, and the game would have been a draw. So, all right, game 2, a dramatic game. So now it's of course, half-half. Magnus has the black pieces. Ding Liren plays e4. Magnus does not repeat his wilder experiments of the last round of yesterday, I guess. No, 2 days ago, sorry. And goes into the Italian. Actually plays h6, which is the same move that Hikaru has been playing. Although he doesn't play a5 here. He plays rook e8, which is sort of the other move. Sorry, here he plays a6 instead of a5. So both are possible. Recently, many players have been playing a5. a6 was the older way to play, sort of preventing a5 prevents the expansion on the queen side by white playing a4, b4. But a6 is covers the b5 square among other things, so it's a little bit more solid. So just a different approach. The highest rated players in the world have played this position, with on both sides, essentially many times. So I think Anish Giri has played this many times. So they get a normal position, and it looked like everything was fine for both sides. Actually, this was a very well played game. So this was actually a key moment after rook a d1, and maybe rook a d1 was not the very best move. It's possible, especially in hindsight, that maybe white should do something to prevent black's next move. I mean, the most direct one is to play c5 yourself. But after rook d1, Magnus very quickly played this move c5, and that's actually a really, really good move. And after that move, I thought it was easier for black to play than for white. And the idea is that after the pawn takes in, so we don't have a way to actually push b5. If we play rook takes d8, queen d8, b5, now this pawn hangs. On the other hand, if you play, because you'd love to play b5 positionally, that's the move you want to play. But, and if you play b5 first, then black can take on d1, rook d1, and then a takes b5, and now their queen is defending that one. So c5 black, once white can't play b5, then they have to take. And now in this position already, white is the one with all the weak pawns here, and so it's an easier position for black to play, I think. However, Ding does find a good way to get counterplay. So he plays knight h4, rook c5, knight f5, rook d7, sensible move, rook d1, queen c7. And now Ding plays rook d6, which is a nice move that basically gives white enough counterplay to hold the position and make a draw. And that should have been the expected result here. But here the really imaginable happened, where Magnus had a bit of a blind spot. I mean, I listened to his post-match interview, and yeah, he... there was a question in the chat, which I will address. Yeah, so he had a blind spot in the interview. He said that he just didn't really, he saw that rook takes f6 was possible, but he didn't think of it in conjunction with queen d2 to h6. And so after rook c4, queen d3, and the question here is, it seems to me, this is coming from Len in the chat, it seems to me that Magnus completely missed the threat of Ding's rook d6. Thus, if Magnus could have passed and moved 30 or 31, he would still have been losing. Is this analysis correct? Yeah, so if he passes, so king h7 is worse than passing, as we will see. However, like if he passes here, for example, yes, I do think, well, here is rook f6 a threat. So let's say we pass and play b5 and that white can't take, which of course they could, but so is rook takes f6 a threat? And I think the answer is yes, it is, because so here, queen h6, queen f8, queen takes f6. Okay, the pawn, if we had actually passed, I just don't have an easy way to pass. The pawn would be on b7. But this position, I think, is going to be better for white anyway. So essentially, rook takes f6 is a threat. And so you could say that it's a threat, that he completely missed. He said that he saw rook takes f6 as an idea, but not in conjunction with trying to mate on h6, which is just, these blind spots are things that are sort of hard to explain, but they happen, and they happen even to Magnus. Normally not very often to him, but I guess in this tournament he's had maybe two sort of, there was another game, I can't pinpoint which one it was, but there was another one where there was a big blunder, and it was sort of a similar, blind spot. So these things happen. But so yeah, Magnus here had ways to hold this, maybe not the simpler, but the most sort of direct way might be rook d4, because it forces a trade of pieces. And so the idea, if knight takes d4, is black wins. There's a pin here. They're not down any material. So white has to take like this, pawn takes, and after these rooks come off, black should just be fine here. Probably the most direct, again, you just take the pawn, and this should be an equal position. For example, knight h6, pawn takes h6, queen f6, and now we have a queen endgame where both sides have trumps on each, white has more pawns on a king side versus the queen side. But it's hard to believe that black will have any trouble holding here by just pushing their b pawn, and eventually white will have to try to find a good way to give a perpetual. So, so yeah, so this position could have been a draw in that way. And then there was another way, actually, which was to play rook c3, and the queen goes back, let's say, to d2, and then actually not to d2. d2, there's knight takes e4. To e2 is a better square. And now again, white is threatening rook takes f6, but black can play rook c2, and then a queen comes back. And then we looked at queen c4, for example, and this one should just be equal. Again, takes. I think knight h6 is enough for a draw, but maybe I think the computer likes this move better. But white should have enough activity to hold here without any problem, but black is obviously fine. So yeah, Magnus plays king h7, and he spent several minutes on this move. And after rook takes f6, pawn takes f6, queen e3, it's just force mate in a couple of moves here. There is literally nothing that black can do. So the score goes to 1.5 to 0.5 for Ding. Now, next game, sort of a must-win situation for Magnus, and it didn't start very well. And there's a lot of activity in the chat right now. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to compare to the interzonal. These tournaments back in the day were really, really long, but they also had a ton of rest days, right? Like they would have these adjournments or adjournment days, and those days would have almost nothing going on. They also had rest days in between. When I used to play the Chess Olympiad, the first times I played in in 2000 I played in Istanbul, they would have, 2 rest days in the middle of the tournament. Everything has kind of been more compact now, making everything faster. So it's, but this one is fast time controls, but a lot of days in a row. And yeah, so anyway, just chess has evolved just like everything else. So another London system, and now Ding plays an interesting move order here, queen to b6, which is somewhat unusual. Magnus plays rook b1, and then the question is the rook better on b1 than on a1, because essentially the queen will probably have to move another time. So it may not change too much. It's possible white will play bishop e2 and then c4 at some point. And yeah, someone is mentioning Colin. That's Colin McGordy, who writes our news. A lot of the news items on our news page are written by him, and he is great. He does a really fantastic job, and it is a lot of work in a tournament like this one. So tip of the hat to him from me and everybody else. So here Magnus plays c3, and this is interesting because in this type of position, we've also seen Magnus play pawn takes c5, queen c5, and then you can play either just bishop e2 or maybe knight b3 followed by c4. These are positions, Magnus has had a game like this, or you could play c3 and not worry too much about the capture on f4 or bishop d3. Magnus has played these positions often, but in this game he plays c3, and something actually goes wrong for him in this game. So I think that this specific move order was very smart by Ding, and I don't know if he was prepared or if he just sort of figured this out, but it worked poorly for Magnus here. He's forced to defend his d-pawn, and now after a5, he's got kind of an awkward decision to make. Either he lets black play a4, which may be followed by queen a5 check, and also pushes the knight back, or he plays a4 himself. But if he plays a4 himself, there's queen b4, which is quite annoying. So yeah, already not the easiest position. So Magnus plays a3, and after a4, he goes to c1, but already he's wasted so much time with that knight that this position is probably already like a good bit better for black. So black makes some natural moves here. Queen c7 was not just a natural move. That was actually a strong move. The idea is that if he takes on c3, pawn takes c3, the queen is attacked. So he takes advantage of this time to get out of that file and attack the f pawn. So Magnus has to defend it. Now he takes, then he plays knight a5. Now this queen suddenly is attacking this pawn. So now white has to defend that one, and it's just a really awkward position for Magnus. It's rare that you see Magnus with such a difficult position with the white pieces. So Magnus decides to just sacrifice the pawn, and in a slower game, I think here Ding would have been looking to convert and win this game with black. I mean, even in this game, I'm sure he was looking to convert and try to win with black. But here he makes a pretty significant mistake, and a move that I'm sure he regretted a lot. It seems like he played f6, which the problem with f6 is that it weakens the light squares sort of forever, really. Well, of course, he had a reason. I mean, he was worried that maybe after castles, that in some cases there would be some bishop h7. Now, in this case, it seems like black is still, we looked at this in the other game, black is probably able to survive this, queen g4 and f5. And unlike in these positions where, white has more pieces around, it seems like here black just manages to escape. I mean, this still is kind of complicated though. So you could see that he would be afraid. But instead of castling, I think the most sort of natural move would have been queen to d6. So just bringing the queen back, waiting to decide where to put the king. Maybe we'll even play b5 first. And it's not obvious how white is going to continue. And, white probably doesn't have enough for a pawn here. So f6 though, suddenly white has real play. And Magnus played this part really well. So queen b1 was a nice move. He's eyeing the h7 pawn. He's also creating this idea of playing rook to a2, chasing the queen back, which now would also attack this pawn. But also he's got this idea to play bishop c2 and try to just circle that knight, win the pawn back, and could be left with a good knight versus bad bishop. So Ding goes back, rook e2. So now he's attacking h7 and bringing his rook to a really good square. h6. It's possible that the best move would have been f5. It's hard to make a move like that, though, that simply, gives that e5 square. And now maybe it would go like bishop c2 or maybe knight e5 first. And we have a game. I mean, maybe Magnus can play for g4 at some point. It looks like white might have just enough play for the pawn at this point. But h6 was a mistake, and now Magnus plays very strong move f5. And this is especially strong when you see the next move. And this was sort of the last chance for Ding to stay in the game. Rook e8 would have kept things sort of under control. It's still risky for black, But this position, even if white gets, the knight h4 as they did in the game, by trading off a whole bunch of pieces, he is closer to holding with the black pieces here. In the game, Ding plays a natural, e takes f5, sort of probably thinking he's going to play rook e8 next. But I think he missed. So if bishop f5, now he could play rook e8. But I think he missed that Magnus plays first knight to h4. And this is really, really strong. Now, now the thing is that he's threatening to take on f5, possibly with the bishop, because if after bishop f5 you play rook e8, then there'll be bishop h7 check and knight g6 come sort of crashing through here. So, so this is already really tough. He decides to play rook e8, which was the idea, but now after knight takes f5, it's actually a real problem. What can he do here? There's really not a good there's not a good move here. He found probably the best in the circumstances. If he moves the queen, there's knight e7 check, followed by knight g6, which is just over. So he takes. So this is basically an exchange sacrifice. Rook takes e8, knight to d2, rook f8. So this was sort of a long fourth variation that Magnus played really well. Rook f8, king f8. And now he finds by far the best move, because if you play queen to d1, this position is actually not entirely trivial. And maybe even bishop here. I don't know which square is better, but this one, the idea is to bring the pawn to a2. And okay, the black king is a little bit weak, but even though you have a pawn for the exchange, and that pawn getting to a2, it might be enough to make a draw. But Magnus here finds a very strong move. He plays queen takes b7, and now there's ideas of mate. So you cannot, for example, take on d3 because of queen c8, king f7, queen e8 mate. And you're also letting black play knight f3, which on the face of it looks really strong. But this was really well calculated by Magnus. Now, only one move works for white. It's king h1. King g2 loses the rook with check. King f1, the bishop on d3 hangs with check. So now knight takes e1, bishop f5. And now, even though it looks like black is almost escaping, in fact, he's got a real problem with his king. There was one move here that is not easy to play, but the one move that would kind of potentially save the game is this move, queen e7, or at least maybe not save the game, but come, have chances to save it. The idea is, like, let's say we play queen a8. Well, there's a few ideas. So if we play queen to d5, then there's queen e2, and so we're creating a counterattack. And I don't think there's a mate here. So for example, like queen d8, king f7, queen d7, we just go back. That's just checks. It's not mate. So this one I think is just a draw. But after queen e7, there's other moves. You can try to play queen a8. You can try to play, actually, queen a6 I think is the really clever little move, because it stops queen e2 and still threatens the pawn. And then what did I look at? a3. Yeah, so a3 loses because of bishop g6, which is similar to the game. This is still sort of a messy position, but black, I guess, has some chances to hold. The strongest move is king f7 to stop bishop g6. Now, there's still this idea that if queen a4, we have queen e2, I think, and this is a draw. So, but anyway, really complicated position. But here, instead of queen e7, Ding played knight to f3, and then after the really strong bishop g6, he's actually forced to resign. And at first, I didn't actually see why. So it took me a second to understand what was going on here. But yeah, the threat is often to play queen b8 and queen b4. So if you play, what was it, queen e6, this very strong move, queen to b4, is something that's probably what Ding missed, actually. Queen e7, queen b8, and it's mate. So and king g8 is mate also. So sort of a crazy two games here. But that set the stage for an amazing last game, where now the score is tied. So all right. So the last game was really very, very tense. So they play a semi-Slav. Bishop e2 is an unusual move. Sometimes, the more... Take off my headphones. Sometimes white plays... Well, the main move is bishop d3, pawn takes c4, b takes c4, b5. So bishop e2, the idea is that if black plays d takes c4, there's an extra idea of playing a4, stopping b5 before taking back. And there's some theory with that. But in this game on bishop e2, Magnus just plays bishop d6. So they get into sort of a normal semi-Slav position where white decided to play this a4 and Magnus responded with a5. And it's a question whether a move like rook c8, letting a5 happen, something like this might be possible, because you can actually see a position where you can play c5 and, you know, maybe exchange off everything and it will be okay. So this is a question. But he played a5, and now Ding plays bishop d3. And we were wondering when we were analyzing here with in the French stream, whether black should have played something like queen e7 followed by e5, because after rook c8, queen e2, c5, we thought that here white's position got to be a little bit better. So we're not sure that this plan to play c5 like this was the right plan. It's possible also to have played queen e7, and then, for example, if we play queen e2 just the same, then I don't know, maybe e5 is possible here. Or maybe even c5 in this position. c5 still knight b5, but maybe just even waiting, like rook c8 or rook e8, and just wait. So because white is not too, this is not too threatening here. If we do the standard exchanges, this position still looks quite reasonable for black. This pawn structure is not too impressive. So interesting. But Magnus plays rook c8, queen e2, c5, which was clearly his idea. But after knight b5, white gets their knight to e5 and then pushes f4. And it seems like at the least in practice, it's a lot easier for white to play. So they get to an interesting position here for sure. After rook d1, Magnus plays rook c d8. And here there was a fascinating line that is hard to see, but the computer gives, and it's really worth looking at. So d5. Now, if pawn takes d5 is more or less forced. If you play knight e5, bishop e4, this one is kind of a disaster. But there's a very interesting line here after ed, bishop takes e4, this is quite typical of this line. Knight takes d7, rook d7. Now, if you play queen g4 to attack this guy and this guy, black has to move f5. So that patches everything up and it's okay for black. However, there's this crazy move, bishop f6. That one is hard to see for a human. And the idea, of course, is if queen takes f6, then rook takes d7. And if pawn takes f6, then check and take on d7. And we actually pick up even more. So, however, there's actually a move that more or less holds for black. Queen e6, f5 to keep the attack going. Now queen takes f6, rook d7, bishop c6, rook somewhere, let's say d2. And this is still a game, especially because black's bishop is very strong on b8, and the white knight may not be that great. This is still a game. It should be better for white, but it's not over at all. So, but this was interesting. Ding plays bishop a3, which felt like maybe it was not quite concrete enough. And I wonder there might be other moves here that are interesting. But yeah, but d5 certainly looked very very interesting. You know, this crazy variation. So, but bishop a3. Now Magnus finds a very interesting way to play against it. He plays knight takes e5, and I think here white, at least in practice, should have taken maybe with this pawn, which is just a little bit more solid. Of course, it looks like, you know, you're kind of giving up on the center. But that being said, it just seems like here white is not going to get in trouble. After he takes with the f pawn, f5 was really strong, and now I started to like black's position more. And so they make some moves here. And already it looks like black has a lot of pressure. Now he's going to be threatening in some cases to play bishop takes e5 sometimes, you know, not all the time. But this position is starting to go wrong for white. And now it looks like Magnus just played a little bit too he was trying, I think, to make moves fast because he didn't have so much time. And he's like, I'm just going to make little moves and improve my position a little bit. But But it looks like if he had been aggressive and played like h5 followed by h4, um, trying to play h3, it's actually pretty. White has nothing to do. Literally, their pieces are almost like the computer just wants to shuffle the pieces around. And here already, this would win. So it's not. I don't know how White is supposed to. You can't really play h3 because it's a huge weakness. It's not. This is a really tough position. So if Magnus had played h5, h4, he might have won this game. In sort of classical fashion. But here things just went crazy. So after White somehow gets their pieces to slightly better squares, suddenly they are almost repeating. And so here I thought Magnus was maybe, that Magnus was going to repeat. But instead he goes knight c3, and now the position just becomes complete mayhem. However, it's a mayhem that seems to be mostly good for White. So d5, knight e2, queen e2. And now the problem is that even though Black is going to be up the exchange, the position just looks incredibly dangerous for Black. And so he plays bishop b7, rook g3, and what else? We looked at, taking on d5, I think is just bad because things just get cracked open for these bishops. And there's moves like, I think I looked at queen d3 here as a possibility, but there's even other moves that are very strong. But basically here it's already very difficult. So he plays bishop b7, rook g3, queen h4, and now he plays d6. So now that bishop, you would think, is basically dead. Although, as you'll see, at the end of the game, the bishop actually comes to life. And amusingly enough, maybe the position is still equal, but it looks like the kind of equal that is mostly good for White. But here, Ding decided not to go for the draw, and it's his turn to say, you know what, I'm playing for a win here with your king like this and the bishop on b8. But after he moves that knight to c3, already things are a little bit more unclear because at any point Black can sacrifice and open up the position for their rooks. So it gets messy. Both sides kind of miss chances around here, and suddenly here the position gets continues to be mayhem. But here Ding makes sort of a blunder. It turns out that e takes d6, rook takes d6, bishop e2, which is quite natural. Of course, I'm sure he saw he could take the bishop back, was the right way to play, but he sort of missed, and they had just seconds here. He decided to take on e6 first. Very natural, you fork everybody, and you're still attacking the bishop. However, after queen e8, instead of taking a bishop, he's taking a rook for a piece, and that's not nearly as good. And not only that, but it also just makes the pieces way better for Black. So, the end of this game is not as high quality as the rest of the game, which was a really interesting game. But yeah, knight takes e6 was sort of a blunder, followed by another blunder here for Ding. But yeah, here he was still doing well. A few moves ago, by the way, I should have mentioned here, Black did have a chance to play f4, and this would still be really complicated, but it does seem to really improve Black's position because there's no easy way to take advantage of the fact that this pawn is pinned. And so, so Magnus missed that one chance. And then once Ding gets his knight to f4, he should be very happy. But here, knight takes e6, a big mistake. Queen e8, he's forced to take an f8, bishop f8. And now it's just unclear. The material is suddenly back to completely equal. 6 pawns against 6, 2 bishops, 1 rook each. However, it's easier for Black to play at this point because the White position is just a little bit loose. Queen f5, g6, queen f1. Now, queen f1 was just a blunder. Here, Magnus already had rook d2 attacking the bishop and g2, but Magnus was playing very fast here. Both have like less than a minute. He plays bishop g7, a positionally very good move, and he's actually still much better here. And now Ding blundered rook d2 another time, and this time Magnus saw it. Turns out the best move probably is rook here, although it's still a pretty bad position for White here. Black will eventually capture this pawn, and his pieces are doing great. White has a lot of weaknesses. sorry, all these pawns are weak. But the game ended with bishop c2, rook d2, and this was a crazy match. Magnus did not have an easy time today. He did not have an easy time against Dane the previous time. So these guys seemed, pretty evenly matched in these games. But Magnus coming through, being a little bit quicker at the end, but it really could have gone either way. So this sets the stage for a big final tomorrow between Hikaru and Magnus. Hikaru was, maybe the most consistent player in this tournament. He didn't really have any bad matches. He played pretty well throughout. He certainly, made some mistakes through, in all these games, but he had a really good performance. So in general, though, Magnus has had good results against him. We'll see if Hikaru can give him a really good match and maybe even beat him tomorrow. I'm sure he's going to give it his best, and there's a lot of money on the line. First prize is $70,000. So yeah, should be really a lot of fun to see. Same time tomorrow, 10 a.m. in the Eastern U.S., 4 p.m. in the Central European time zone. I will likely be doing French commentary. If you feel like working on your French, tune in for a little bit. Otherwise, of course, we'll have the regulars on the English side doing a great job as always. So I'm going to leave you with this for today. I need a little bit of rest. Maybe some of you do too. It was an exciting day of chess. And yeah, I will see everybody hopefully tomorrow. And I am looking forward to it. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and have a good night.